How should Christians behave towards their government? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Romans on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 7. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible, we can turn to Romans chapter 13, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Romans chapter 13, beginning at verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise of the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Paul has spent the first 11 chapters presenting a theological argument of how we are saved, by the works of the law of Moses or by faith. The reason he needed to make this argument was because the Jewish and Gentile Christians in Rome and in other places seemed to be divided over this question. To many of the Jewish Christians, Christ was the Messiah, the one who came to save man from sins, but they saw him as an addition to the law of Moses rather than the fulfillment of it, the one who ushered in a new covenant. Thus, some taught their Gentile counterparts that they must obey the law of Moses in order to be a Christian, and also be circumcised in order to be in a covenant relationship with God. But is circumcision and obedience to the law of Moses how Abraham was saved? No, he was saved by God's grace received through obedient faith. The reason we can know this is because in Abraham's day, the law of Moses didn't exist, and God counted Abraham as righteous before the ordinance of circumcision was given. Thus, Abraham couldn't be justified by these things, and in reality, neither was anybody else. The law of Moses condemned the one who broke it, but did not remove the sin problem because the blood of bulls and goats couldn't remit sin. They needed Jesus to atone for sin, to pay the price for sin, to become that propitiation. And Jesus did this apart from the works of the law of Moses. Sure, Jesus obeyed the law of Moses, but he did more than that. He fulfilled it. Thus, nobody, Jew or Gentile, would be saved by it. They would be saved by grace received through obedient faith. And in chapter 12, we saw how the Christians should respond to this outpouring of love by presenting our bodies as living sacrifices to God, by fulfilling our role in the church, by loving both our friends and our enemies without hypocrisy, and by as much as possible living peaceably with everybody. That means we're not to be rebels, a point that segues nicely into chapter 13 and how the Christian should act towards their government. In verse 1, Paul says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. In other words, governments, whether they be local, provincial, or country governments. Why? Because the authority they have is given by God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. First of all, Paul lived under the Roman government with all of its evil. Thus, when Paul made this statement, he was referring to all governments, no matter if they're good or bad. Now, Paul doesn't say we have to agree with the government, but we do have to submit to them, even if they're dictators, even if they treat their citizens poorly, even if they pass laws we don't like. The only exception to this rule would be what we've studied thus far in Acts 5:29, where if civil government tells us to do something that is against God's law, we must obey God first. So, if the government bans all religious services on Sunday, we have to obey God rather than man, because the Christian is to worship God on Sunday. But if the government bans all religious services on Sunday before noon, then our religious services must begin after noon, because there is no law of God saying we have to meet in the morning. Might it be inconvenient, or even non-traditional? Yes. But he who resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, because being subject to the governing authorities is an ordinance of God. And so if we break that ordinance, we will bring judgment on ourselves, not only from God, but from this government too. In truth, there are very few laws that governments pass that would force us to disobey God. We always must look for a way to obey God and man due to passages like this. It might require us to think outside the box, to adapt, and to alter tradition that is not grounded in the commands of God, like the time of service or the number of songs we sing, etc. It is only in those rare occasions that government oversteps and would force us to disobey God that we have permission to obey God over men, because obeying government is obeying God. The second thing I would like us to examine is the authorities that exist are appointed by God. This statement has led a lot of people to misunderstand what Paul is saying, leading to the doctrine of the divine right of kings and leading people to conclude that God personally appoints every leader that rises up. If such is true, I must warn people that that means God raises up even people that we politically disagree with. So even that doesn't give us the right to resist the government. But is this true? Well, does God personally choose everyone who is saved and lost? We learn from chapter 8 that that is no. He selects who will be saved on a macro level, Christians. He selects how one is saved, by grace through faith. We're the ones who have the free will either to obey in faith or not. That is what Paul is saying here in Romans 13. Sure, God can and has in the past selected certain rulers in order to accomplish his purpose. But he doesn't have to select each individual ruler. He could simply allow time and circumstance to play out. And so we need to be very careful when we say this ruler or that ruler was selected by God, especially when that ruler agrees with our political leanings or disagrees. We don't get to speak for God, and so let's be humble enough to recognize that God ordained that there be governments to rule over us. God has the ability to raise nations up and bring them down, but he also has the power to allow us to lead ourselves, either to our benefit or our detriment. What is the role of government? Well, we see here that first and foremost it is to punish evildoers. Seeing as how we're not to take vengeance ourselves, that precludes vigilante justice. How then are evildoers punished? Well, God could strike every evildoer down on the spot, but he has chosen not to do that. Instead, he has given government the authority to punish evildoers for crime. And for the most part, if we do that which is good and right, we do not have to fear the government, but will receive praise of the same by doing good. It's only when we do evil that we should be afraid of the government, for the government does not bear the sword in vain, meaning it has the right to execute judgment, which includes capital punishment. It is to use this power justly. But even if it doesn't, Christians are still not to resist, recognizing that God will hold those in government accountable on the judgment day for how they wielded their power. Thus, we are to obey governments not only to avoid punishment, but also so we can have a clear conscience, knowing that we have obeyed the will of God. The second role of government is to care for the needs of its citizens. Now, partisan politics usually determines the opinion as to what counts as the needs of its citizens, but God has given governments the right and the responsibility to care for the needs of its citizens and to levy taxes and customs in order to carry out that function. As such, Christians are to pay their taxes, and that means all the taxes that are required. But what if government uses my money for things I don't approve of, or things that are sinful? Well, we've learned from Acts 5 that once our money is out of our control, that we're no longer responsible for it. Someone else is. If our government uses our money for sinful things, they will give account for that, not us. We will give an account, though, as to whether we paid the taxes and customs that we were to pay to government, and whether we showed them the honor and respect that these officials deserved as being God's ministers. Note, there were no exceptions given in verse 7. We may not like our leaders, but we need to honor and respect them regardless. Such is possible, but it requires effort on our part. In practical terms, that means we're not to demean our leaders, speak evil of them, or threaten them. We're not to rebel against them, being involved in insurrections, even if they're tyrants. We're to pray for them, that they may choose good, and we're to pray that we may live peaceably even under a tyrannical government. And then, of course, if our country gives us the right to vote on who will lead us, by all means, we can vote them out of office. But not all countries give their citizens that right. In that case, we must submit to our government, because submitting to government is submitting to God. We'll continue with chapter 13, Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Romans chapter 13, verses 8 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.